Basically, my brief today was to do a short history of spatial art. It really sort of is something I've been interested in for a long time. It's probably one of those projects in my back pocket for it to be taken out one day to do as a proper project. You know, the hidden project people have gotten hidden away. But as you'll see, it'll be a Herculean effort to put it together. So I'll start to do it, but it'll be tangential to the show. So it really explains the show and how these practices arrive, and sort of gives a little bit of a history for spatial art. But along the way, you'll see I'm going to try and push spatial art as a type of alternative history of what happens in the 20th century. Okay, so of course, if we think of examples of particularly public art, the idea of very spatial art. Okay, they didn't tell me how to use the setup here, so you're right.
So we're just keeping the lights on because we're filming the program.
Okay. Don't worry, this one's a little bit washed out anyway, but you can see it's a projection in the middle of Chicago. So the basic point I just want to make is that there is a lot of spatial art in most cities of the world today. We call it public art, call it quite a range of different things, but I want to see this sort of approach as something that is maybe the culmination point of the history I want to show. So that you see there's works that are commissioned, like these works are different types of papers, wallpapers, etc. for this installation. So there's temporary installations, and then also things like Eliasson's sort of trompe l'oeil project, where you have this fountain. You all know this sort of work, yeah? You know, it's a Brooklyn Bridge, of course, going across there. I like these little things. And you see the waterfall here, which consists of the work. So you have this waterfall that occurs in the middle of nowhere, this idea of this incongruous yet poetic idea. Another sort of spatial work. So the question of space, what is it then? I don't want to delve into too much theory and history about this, just show Kepler 62F. When we destroy this planet, this is our next place to go. It's a long journey, but it's the most likely habitable thing in space. So why I use this is because the general idea of space, when you think about it, when you ask people, it's usually this idea of like outer space or space in the built environment. So there is a range of different ideas you can use of space, where, what, when. Why I think this is interesting space is because it's like colour. It's one of those things in the visual arts that's at the cusp of a range of different fields: the sciences, the aesthetic field, cultural fields, social practices, and spaces are very much like colour. One of those things that is range across the different types of approaches to philosophy too. You have your empirical approach, your rational approach, etc., a neuroaesthetic approach. Space similarly has that sort of aspect. And what I wanted to talk about too was this idea of these the apparatuses for constructing ideas of space. So this one idea of space, how we conceive it socially, culturally. Space, it's a perceived space. There's conceived space. There's also space that's produced through certain cultural practices. So the key one for the visual arts, and one that's played out a number of times in the exhibition as well in different ways, is perspective. Perspective is one of those approaches that develops around the 15th century. It takes a while to emerge. But it's all these studies that are, again, are across the cusp of maths, sciences, and the visual arts, and it's trying to create this idea of a coherent, tangible, unified space. Now, many of you may know that there's a lot of histories to perspective. Why perspective is important? Because in the Western tradition, one argument for why modernism emerges late in the visual arts, quite comparative to other areas. If you think of mercantile banking, one of the key indicative aspects of what happens at the Renaissance, that emerges a lot earlier, but modernism is seen as a late reaction to the perspectival system. And perspective gradually begins to have an increasingly major role in the history of the West. It starts off as these studies to develop this sort of idea. The argument would be that it comes from Giotto and maybe even from classical sources. That's all been revised recently with people like Hans Belting in a book called Baghdad and Florence, or Florence and Baghdad, points out a point that people often make at the moment now is that the sources for perspectival system come from Arabic mathematics, in particular Al-Hassan's work in optics from the 11th to 12th centuries, and then that emerges and gets taken up later on. And Belting argues then that this approach emerges from the Arabic source, and then there isn't a direct link from someone like Giotto 2 centuries earlier to the 15th century, but there's this different source that's very important for it. The purpose for my argument is not an argument about perspective, it's about how important it is and why in spatial theory the issues that they see involved in this sort of practice in the late 19th and early 20th century. You can see this idea of unifying all space with singular perspective. You have a vanishing point which you can move up or down so that the image, the plane, gets a sense of depth, and everything contained with it was seen to have this tangible whole presence. There's an interesting recent book. Paul Wood has done a study of Western art and its relationship to other cultures, and he points out that perspective, when it first begins, isn't seen as this idea of Western superiority. It's a fascination for a different one. So it's very important in Venice, where it trades around the regions, but it only gradually gets linked up with a scientific model in the 18th century, or particularly a Western model of superiority. This emerges much later. But within perspective, there's some interesting issues that'll be important for spatial work. This is Masaccio's The Trinity fresco. It's if you've seen it, it's in Florence. You see the burial there. The donors are outside the picture frame, so to speak. I mean, they're painted, but then you have this architectural vault, which is meant to be three-dimensional. One of the arguments about this work is that everything does fit. You see it in black and white. And there's a fixed space where you can see it. If you stand there, everything flows into perspective, so it gives this stuff of a very illusionistic space. So if you're standing there, slightly different to here. But what happens is a flat space gets this idea of this spatial depth. One of the arguments about this, though, is that Masaccio paints this so that all these figures, including the external patrons who paid for the painting, are in a consistent three-dimensional space, but the figure of God behind, where you have the Trinity holding up Christ's figure, is flat to the picture plane, so that there's this dual system going on, so that the figure of God is in a different space, not a human space. So flat to the wall, basically, rather than having this coherent projection. Now, there are certain studies that occurred really early on, and there's a famous study by an art historian, Panofsky, who talks about these sorts of things that artists knew really early on, this idea of setting up this sort of box. It gave a unified way of measuring the world, putting a pictorial system together that was tangible, coherent, but it also was a sort of a fabrication. So there was attempts to study how the eye moves and how it sees on a flat wall. And if that spatial projection goes further on, you get what they call marginal distortions, and then artists trying to map these. And also the fact that, there are certain things that this very old argument about is the world the way it is, or is the way we see the world that figures the way it is, so that you see that columns, for instance, the subjective thing where in architecture they have this sort of blurring say, in the Parthenon, where there's this curving to make things look straight, and so that if you do this, you'll get this sort of impression. And then artists taking on board this sort of thing and making adjustments for it. So then, with all these range of adjustments, you get a playing out of various different things. Because with Mantegna, you have those very extreme foreshortenings that occur here. So that these are very high. You would have seen it. No one will have seen this probably in their lifetime, because it's now, it was destroyed in World War II. But they're often about this height, so that you're looking at the shoe line. They call it worm's eye view, but you have this extreme barrel foreshortening. So you could move around with it and play around with it quite a bit. And Giulio Romano is that even more. And with the vault, it seems to be moving out of the picture frame, out beyond into another space. So when I want to talk about this short history of spatial culture, there's a couple of things that are repeatedly mentioned in the earliest work, and I see this work as coming out of a direct engagement with particularly synthetic cubism, maybe analytical synthetic cubism, where that was going, where that leaves off in World War I, and you come out people at the other end and you have works like this, where you have an artist, Eric Buchholz. The gallery actually owns a few works of his. They could have had more, but that was a sort of a oversight on their part, I'd say. His daughter used to live here, and he created one of the first installations in his own apartment. And this, the consistent thing that you find with artists of this period is when they're talking about perspective, they're talking about the fact that it works as a system if you have one eye and you're fixed in the middle of that room, like we saw with the Masaccio diagram, and you have one eye covered and everything fits into place and you don't move. So there's always an ideal viewing spot. And so one of the things they want to talk about then is a different type of viewing, where you have a mobile viewing, where you're moving around the room, where you've got stereoscopic vision, etc., or just having two eyes. And sort of they see this then as being more tangible and working out with the world. And what Buchholz does with this first experiment is, and it was largely overlooked for a long time, was an experiment to play around with different spatial connections around the room. So it's his apartment. It also no longer exists. It's the area around the National Museum in Berlin, and this whole area was destroyed. But what you would see at this end is an open window, you can imagine like this, and your small rectangular apartment, and you can see he even fitted a piano in there, and then a fireplace, all these things which he covered up. And then you have these images that begin to be just not representational, but spatial or geometrical, and you have these ellipses and little cues that play around both with the architectural components of the room and also play around with this sort of like this cone shape, the eclipse form here, but also this idea of centre point perspective, but also the explosion of this sort of system, but playing off with cues like the rectangular features of the door here, etc., being replayed around the place. The other interesting thing about Buchholz, he uses gold as well as red, black, very primary, and the tones. Another thing that he was interested in, there's a whole book of studies of his architectural designs, and he had this idea for mobile screens in the city. There was this idea of creating screens that would be like the forerunner perhaps of LED projections, but also like movie screens. So he had this idea that they could run along and be move around corners and have this sort of projection into space. And he often has this interplay between the sphere and the square or rectangle, and creating spatial plays through those forms. One thing, Buchholz liked to refer to his apartment, this one here, as both an artwork and they didn't use the term installation then, but it was also a meeting place. And it was a meeting place for a range of different people who were interested in this idea of exploding the picture plane, letting the picture plane sort of go out and fly around the room, if you like. And they were interested in studies like kinetic art, the idea of the mobile eye, etc. So they'd have discussion sessions in here. So it was a family home as well as a meeting place for a lot of artists. Like, just one thing before I pass on, because this is a quick sketch, I could show you quite a few images of this, and what happens if you see the photographs is that it's clear from photographs that exist at the time that he constantly moved these shapes. So there wasn't a sense that it was fixed in place, that there was a constant movement and of the forms within themselves. For instance, there's another one here where you don't see this shadow form, you just see this form leading to the rectangular form here. A visitor that he claims, there's Adolf Berne, the architectural critic. There was Viking Egling, who came down from Scandinavia and was doing works like Fischinger, you see next door. The first, sort of his Diagonal Symphony, which were all handwritten, very analogue, very laboriously done. The idea of recreating film so that it would be used sort of spatially, but also like a sort of a cued from simple forms to music, and then so he elaborated on this form. So it's just one of the different types of projects that were occurring and being discussed at Buchholz's apartment. Egling actually finished this, completed the Diagonal Symphony, and then died 1925 or 6. So just goes to show you that analogue art is very laborious and bad for you. Buchholz was always upset by Lissitzky. Lissitzky got all the credit, he argues, and he sort of argues that Lissitzky ripped him off. Lissitzky came to Berlin at this stage and said that he was an ambassador for the Soviet Union. That's never been verified, but a lot of people took him seriously. But if you see the Pro-Un room, this is reconstructed. So is Buchholz's room now. You'll see a lot of the works that you see here were all reconstructed in the 60s. So you get Lissitzky's room, Schwitter's, Mertz's, Bau, Buchholz's room, all reproduced in the 60s. And what they did was they enclosed this one. So where it was is an exhibition, and Buchholz, Baumeister, Burkhardt and Lissitzky were all asked to do these spatial projects. So what you would see around the Greater Berlin art exhibitions was works by Van Doesburg and people like this in other rooms and other parts of the installation. And they wanted to have 4 these sort of installation rooms. And it was also at the time, the economy was a complete mess at that stage, as you probably know from the Weimar Republic. The economy had collapsed. It was the beginning of hypercapitalism. And the hyperinflation, sorry. And there was only enough money basically for Lissitzky to do his room. So this diagram shows you that you came in here and you were moved around. You had this sort of rectangular form. You come around here, there's another cue there of a rod, and this would be repeated on the ceiling, which this is this axiometric projection that Lissitzky and Van Doesburg were very keen on using quite a lot. And then you finish with this Malevich sort of black square, and you left the room out there. So it's a passageway or progress through. What's interesting though, when you see that enclosed, it does do interesting things. You can see that this form here that is actually in a quite strangely tangential, when you see it to the surface, it's on this sort of angle, but when you see it in a perspectival system, it seems to almost match up that way. Of course, it doesn't up the top. So this one mimics it too. So there's all these plays of your eye following certain alignments, mainly this one here, which is matched up there. And you see it cuts across there, and there, and you see the sphere, the little half semi-cone, which you've seen in, where, Ellie? Buchholz's room. So this is the sort of thing Buchholz would be upset about, that the fact that these little cues came directly from his own room and he never got the chance to show his own project. So it remained a private room, and Liszewski's got the one to do the famous Proun. So this is a little bit of a task where he begins to develop putting suprematism and constructivism together. It's a bit story, but it's interesting that one aspect of this is this whole idea of playing out perspectival expectations and then running them against one another. See, he's thinking about this sort of idea of axiometric projection. You see it in view A, it's this way. View B, upside down, it sort of has this other aspect. So he was also looking at exhibition design, how you could create this sort of mobility, this visual mobility in space as well. And there are different little nodges like wood here, etc. So different surface aspects, so that you can see them here. This is also, and what you would have here is a machine that, or a pulley system which would have the works on constant rotation, so that these works could move around and disappear. And also, with this sort of wooded section here, it was coloured on certain sides, so that as you moved around, you get this variation of different, your view of the room would change as you see in this sort of thing here. This is what he wanted to create, this variability. There's actually an aspect of this taken up in Rory Grounds's the Academy of Sciences in Canberra has that sort of wooden panelling too. It's very similar. John McCarthy's here, he can tell us whether it's a direct translation or not. Just to show you some other things Liszewski was doing, the so-called cloud buildings. I mean, this is the days where they're thinking of what high-rises would look like in the future. So, he's taken a collage of a Russian street scene and projected these big skyscrapers of the future. And of course, what he had was this idea that they would be horizontal. So they'd be like little clouds, a little bit like the work you see out in the exhibition, with it's also a cloud, hence the Vulcan section. So little cloud-shaped things that, interesting to see a different direction that high-rise could go. Architecturally, there's a lot of this sort of spatial elaboration going on, very similar things. This is a very bad slide, actually. Kiesler's Endless House, a lot of these projects, like the video next door with Fischinger, were projects that they worked on from the 20s and worked on for many, many decades. Kiesler had this idea that, he's just do this biomorphic form, this freely forming movement, this sort of idea of a continuous house where he called the endless house. And the idea, of course, that was similar to a lot of these projects is this synthesizing painting, sculpture, architecture and the environment and this very early interdisciplinariness was also about breaking the picture frame, moving outside the picture frame and extending all the various arts together. And in Kiesler's own different project, there was this idea that this sort of endlessness of the extending possibilities of the human form and of the house, etc. as well. Someone who takes a different approach, Adolf Loos, also I think very interesting plays on spatiality. There's an interesting play with these sort of, a discourse about Loos playing around with one of the key aspects of modernity that comes in is that the negotiation of public and private space, which is actually a big and interesting debate now today, where you have social media eroding the boundaries between what's public and private and people not knowing the difference sometimes. And Loos bringing in this idea of stages, like the stage or the theatre box, so that you have places where you stage seeing and you have these staged events between the private and the public, so someone could come in here and you could be already seeing them. So they're already on stage. Your visitors become the stage. So you have this sort of complex play of materials and this sort of whole thing about how where you reside. This slide didn't work out well, but another one for the Verkbund housing estates, where again you have this over big wide window and this sort of stage in here, which is another type. This play of public-private within architecture is another sort of spatial motif. So there's quite a play between visual arts, architectural design, and there is a big split between this. If this history is feasible, one problem with it is that there are people who continue with it, but there's a big break. And what happens is a lot of these projects, the funding for them in the interwar period disappears, and there's not a real beginning to take up this sort of standstill about the sort of late 50s, 60s. A famous sort of almost hyperbolic example would be Super Studio, where they have these projections of this world-connected system that floats around the world. It's like imagining, in a way, this sort of super horizontal modernity that's going around the globe. It's, in this case, a sort of, you can imagine it's sort of like a realisation of the web today. It interconnects everything and just captures everything in its grasp at the same time. Peculiarly, Super Studio, it's on the cusp of some sort of utopian and dystopian moment, and that's one of the things that becomes more prevalent after the war, as you think. And that's true with Smithson, who's notably seen as this idea of bringing in a new spatial, I guess, or a historical way of thinking about art is entropic states. And I do think there's quite a significant contribution with Smithson thinking about it in these sorts of terms. Looking at moments of entropy where systems collapse on itself and how art can involve that. And of course, but they're still all very spatial works like this one, the asphalt one. And what's interesting is Smithson comes out of a deep engagement with abstraction, post-war American abstraction, mixed with sci-fi, mixed with interest in sciences, but and also minimal art, and was interested in these sort of states that are naturally entropic phases, where you could imagine this sort of spiral turning in on itself and then to the point where it cracks and corrodes and can't withstand itself. And he's interested in these sort of natural metaphors as being cultural metaphors. And this one looks very minimalist, this work Plunge, where again based on things like cellular division, but also as a sculptural unit. Some of these Smithson ones are really interesting because you really need to see them. They have these sense of repetition on a very minimalist scale, one after the other, but when you see them, actually they change quite dramatically. So by the end, they become quite more horizontal, to the point where you're going to think they're about to tip over. So again, it's a sort of very subtle way of doing entropic ideas, and you can see they're a little bit more vertical there, and they become more flatter out here, and they push outward. You can see also that he's introducing these sort of ideas in the context of sort of very minimal art. And the famous spiral jetty, perhaps one of the more famous spatial works of the second half of the 20th century. You can see this. I must have used it. I've worn it out, have I? Okay, I'll have to point. The spiral goes out, and you can see that there's. I hope I haven't done all of it. It's just pure rock into a dead lake, and I should have shown pictures of it. It was just done by truck, dropped out and moved out, and creating this sort of image of the spiral. And bench, that's it in its completed state. I like this slide because it has this sort of idea that it's illusionistic, like it's going up into the sky, but it's just the fact that this sort of lake is so dead and salty. And this is an aerial view of it in 2003. Many of you may know that a short time after Smithson created it, and he died not long after it actually, within a few years in a plane crash, but the work was submerged and it reappeared in, you can see this is a picture from 2003, and this is another, but a more poetic, less dystopian view of Smithson's. It's like his little gift to us in the afterwards is the fact that it's re-emerged, completely transformed into this sort of new work, and is just completely different looking work, which I guess was the intention. It was always planned to do this. Someone else, Gordon Matter Clark, doing a Gillian Orr. If you know your female Australian performance artist, it's like a Jill Orr work. Matter Clark, also interested in architectural space, but also by this stage interested in the derelict, the left behind. He said he wanted to create architectural spaces that he could create into an image, and then he was interested in these sort of cut-out shapes of abandoned lots, and to this idea of recovery and, you know, the aesthetic of something that's been disregarded, left behind. These are all the sort of things that Matter Clark talks about in his works, but again it shows a spatial, where the different areas this sort of spatial projects take on. You see this cut through a few floors down. Office Baroque. And South American artist, yes, Soto, a nylon cube. I'd say this is also a spatial work in a way. It's just nylon strings and just slight colour arrangement, and it's a bit much like a colour work, but also it's barely there, and at the same time has quite an impressive impact when you see it in situ. And works like similar time Dan Graham, who's been doing this sort of work since the 60s, these sorts of ideas of, this is work on the Dia Foundation, taking off the idea of, you know, banks and the use of glass in architecture, and how glass creates these they're a little bit like mazes. I think he sort of sees the sort of information flow and the flows of cities, and these sort of glass and the play of glass making transparency, ending up like mirrors again, and for him becoming really like the urban fabric, becoming like a maze. So it's quite different to the projections of, say, Buchholz that you had earlier on. And then Kippenberger with these sorts of, I think these are quite utopian in a way. It's the idea that you go into these installations, they're sort of dead ends, but they go, they're imaginary journeys that you can take. So this line, of course, you can end up in Lausanne or Boston, and it's in the middle of Philadelphia. So again, just this installation in this site. And just to show that this sort of idea of these sort of void spaces was, you find in Smithson in 67, a little bit of the Sublime here, but the Sublime is a sort of more dystopian future, I guess. And you can't not finish by saying there's also this taking up of spatial fascinations, particularly the turn of the last century around, there's a spate of movies that you've heard as the century began to finish. They're all really Platonic, actually. They're all this idea of whether we can trust the world or the world's been fabricated. And this is a theme that you'll find that goes back to Plato's cave. the whole question of appearance, what's the real, how do you know what's what, and there's quite a few works that are around this time. So that sort of aspect of spatiality is still a key theme. See, the Truman Show, where the guy's is on his own TV show without knowing it. And the creator, of course, you know, probably those of you who've seen the film know that he's always usually wearing a beret, which means he's sort of probably an artist. So he's seen as this kind of mad creator genius who's gone too far with his, and here he's looking at the character who's asleep, except the guy doesn't know he's a character. And interesting enough, this sort of scene where he goes to find out that he can leave the cave, and there is a world beyond that, is sort of like an artwork in itself. So it's interesting because it's all a painted facade of the horizon. And there's Dark City. Have any of you seen these movies? They're all really about truth, appearance. People get redone during the night, reworked out so that their memories have, and this character goes at the end to follow this woman out here, which is also the end of the world, of this world that's created. This sort of Dark City is just in this sort of cinematic short span. And Existence, which also plays with these sort of spatial plays between real and appearances, which a lot of works deal with as well, but it's interesting that there's that aspect running over it. So I think the Holocaust is one of the big changing moments of spatial work, but spatial work's been transformed by a lot of these factors like the history of the 20th century, and that's why they take such different approaches. So Eisenman's one's both like architectural, an artwork, a sculpture, etc. It's a sort of effect. And also you see kids playing around in it like it is another maze too. And spatial was just to finish then to show two more recent ones. These are by a woman called Elena Kovalina, and what it is she's like a post-Soviet artist, I guess. She's active in Russia today, and she does these performances in the snow in Moscow, and all these people get gradually snow-covered. They look a bit uncomfortable, but they're all on chairs of different heights, and it's this sort of outdoor installation dash performance where the idea is that to create a thing so that everyone is equal. So there's this sort of idea of an ironic sort of idea of the society that it's come from and what it is in contemporary Russia today. And recreated that recently for Manifesto, which was a controversial show because a lot of people wanted to boycott it. But she created this one in the main square where the Russian Revolution occurred, in front of the Hermitage where the Manifesto was, and there was an aspect of it there and part of it there too, and this long spatial play. Again, it's a spatial play because it's also a spatial play about the site it's in as well. And someone you would have seen, who's in the Art Gallery in New South Wales a few years ago, also did a work inside the Hermitage in a passageway where there's a lot of paintings of great feats in Russian history, like admirals, generals, wars that have been won, and then created this sort of humble abode that you went up the stairs to, and then inside found a sort of Soviet era dwelling inside it. So this is my quick sketch of spatial practice. What I've tried to do is to sort of explain the initial impetuses for it, what happened in the 20th century, how perspective was a key issue and a trigger for it, and also along the way to try and show that the various permutations and the different approaches that are taken up within spatial practices, and then how it changes and transforms. And I guess if you go out to the exhibition, you'll see various modulations of this sort of history. And so that's it.